Hi there, I'm Samuel Doveri Vesterbye, the director of the European Neighbourhood Council and the host of MEDIATIZED EU podcast series. Today, we're continuing our deep dive into the MEDIATIZED EU project, a 4-year initiative funded by the European Union through the Horizon program. And this project brings together partners from 7 countries: Georgia, Belgium, Ireland, Spain, Estonia, Hungary, and today also Portugal. In previous episodes, we've dived into the earlier stages of our research, discussing kind of the key findings of the desk research, policy scoping report, the media analysis, and the shared insights from interviews with political and media elites from all of these countries. Also kind of shedding light on the discourses from the EU and their influence on policymakers and journalists. And so at this point, our teams have conducted nationwide surveys in the countries I mentioned before. And we've also held discussions with various public groups about those findings. And the findings of these efforts provide a pretty rich perspective on the state of debate surrounding the European project and how it's represented in the public opinion of each country and how this European integration is going. And so today, I'm joined by my colleague from Portugal, Dr. Raquel Freire, who is Professor in International Relations at the Faculty of Economics of the University of Coimbra in Portugal. And Raquel will discuss the findings from Portugal and offer deeper insights into how the EU is portrayed and perceived there. So let me start by welcoming you, Raquel, and thank you for joining me here today.
Thank you. Happy to join.
So let me jump right in with the first question. What were the key findings from the nationwide survey that you completed as part of the project in Portugal?
Well, I'd start by saying that media consumption shows that most of the respondents here in Portugal still access their news through the TV. We are talking about 74%, right, which is still quite a big number, while 41% get their news from the print press. This is quite interesting, and recent studies still show that this is very much the case. And when we look at the Portuguese population survey, this clearly reinforces to a great extent the results from the previous phases of the research that we have conducted. And so maybe the first point to make should be that Portuguese respondents have quite a positive attitude towards Portugal's integration into the EU. This is very clear. A significant majority, we are talking about a little bit over 85%, right, that believe Portugal has benefited from being an EU member, with only 13% saying otherwise. And connected to these, the topics that have been associated to the pragmatic benefits arising from EU integration have been associated mainly with economic development. This is also very, very clear, and we are talking of a majority, around 56%. And then issues like better social welfare, human rights and democracy is always also there, and security and migration. And these are the topics that also prevail in our media regarding EU-related affairs, which shows the connection between what is covered, let's say, and the main concerns of the population surveyed. And overall, we also found that there is some general knowledge about the EU, with 30% of those that were surveyed responding correctly to all the questions we asked about the EU. A second point I would like to make relates to trust in institutions. And it is very interesting that the European Commission and European Parliament have significant trust rates. And these are a little bit over 50%, making European institutions more trusted than the national ones. So in Portugal, the Portuguese government and Parliament only got a 40% trust rate. In the survey, we've also presented declarations, right, about the EU, which resulted from our previous research work. And the interviewed had to state their level of agreement or disagreement with certain statements. And here again, the survey confirmed that this majority of the Portuguese have this positive view of European integration, especially concerning the provision of humanitarian aid in the context of the war in Ukraine, the US promoting economic development and assisting at times of crisis, such as, for example, with the pandemic, and the protection and promotion of democratic principles. And this goes all in line with what I have just mentioned. However, it was relevant also to note some criticism regarding EU's lack of solidarity and unity, and is mostly related to perceptions on economic issues. And this drew almost 68% of agreements, and also the idea that EU decisions usually contemplate only the interests of the stronger member states, and these almost reached 60% of agreements. And so we can always, despite this overall support, we can still find a critical stance on the EU. And so this brings a nuanced approach to how we see the European Union. And additionally, also in this line, more than half of the respondents, we are talking about 51%, agree that Portugal lags behind in the EU. So we call it in the tail of Europe, which suggests that many do not really see the country as a central player in the European Union. And also of relevance, and I'm almost finishing, is the view on the militarization of European foreign policy and its normative dimension. This is interesting in the current context of war in Europe and the current debates that are going on about normative and military defense. And we found that most respondents, so 43.8%, agree that militarization contradicts EU values, and only around 13% disagreed with these statements. And moreover, this was the statement that gathered more neutral answers, which is also quite interesting when read in conjunction with a substantial percentage of respondents in favor of a European army. So the current context of war in Ukraine and its extension, let's say, in time, has of course been playing an important role here. So in a nutshell, I'd say the survey results offer a picture of political engagement in Portugal and reveal this duality, right? That on the one hand, there is a highly positive perception about the EU in general, while also, on the other hand, we find lines of criticism regarding certain EU policies and practices, and these particularly point at Portugal's peripheral position within the Union.
Thanks so much for this explanation. Yeah, and it's not so dissimilar to some of the other countries' national surveys that we've seen. Again, we notice that people are divided on many topics or see the EU differently depending on which policy we're looking at. Moving on to the second question, could you also maybe share a little bit the outcome from the civic discussions you conducted? Because, we'd like to also understand what were the characteristics of the groups that were involved in the event, and what are the main takeaways from those discussions?
Yeah, sure. So our civic, this was really a very interesting phase in the process, and our discussions involved university professors, and these were from international relations and European studies. We also had PhD and master students also from these study areas, and journalists, particularly some covering international and European affairs. So it was a group that we gathered together exactly based on these common interests in our work on the European Union and these regional or international dynamics. So we understood this was a knowledgeable group on the topics we were dealing with. And so on this, maybe I can make four main points. So first, most participants agreed that news coverage of EU affairs, both in the print media and on TV, is higher in quantity than they were expecting. So there's a lot going on. But in general, they also agreed that the coverage in mainstream media tends to be rather superficial. So the way EU affairs are covered. And they basically reproduce to a great extent official discourses about the EU. And so we lack in-depth diversity of sources and critical perspectives. And it was very interesting because journalists went even further in this assessment by pointing out the concrete conditions of news production. And they were saying mainly that there is a lack of means for a qualified coverage that would need to include better remuneration, for example, and more specialization of journalists, which we thought was quite an interesting takeaway. A second point, it also became clear from the research that the general public shows quite low levels of interest in the EU. And participants in the civic discussions thought this could be due but not limited to the institution itself, but reflect a more general perception of these interests and somehow lack of contact with political affairs in general. A third point has to do with the pragmatic factors I've been already talking about, and particularly economic issues, because these are clearly the most covered aspects on the EU. But what came also quite clearly in the discussion and was highlighted was that the pragmatic identity interplay comes often to the table, such as regarding the trend among the political elites to instrumentalize the idea of Portugal as representing European values, right, as being a factor of stability, national projection, and in this way making European identity somehow an interested identity, if we can say it like that, which we thought was also quite interesting. And a fourth point has to do with how the Portuguese case differs from other cases, as for example, the fact that even with the anti-system political parties, the convergence regarding the EU's relevance persists. And this has to do with the Portuguese political and civic culture. So I'm talking about our more right-wing party, which is still supportive of the EU. And after the Carnation Revolution in 1974 and the end of the dictatorship, the consolidation of democracy in Portugal was, despite all the difficulties, very much aligned with the project of European integration. And this persists in historical memory, which is how we have been framing, right, this kind of political alignment. And differently from other European countries, where, for example, border disputes or ethnic issues are quite fierce and clearly fracturing topics, these are not really part of the Portuguese political agenda. So making this assessment on how the EU deals with some of these issues less relevant, right, in terms of how it impacts on EU perceptions. And we found this also relevant. Maybe just mention a nice takeaway that was this need to further explore the perception of the youth, to understand which factors most motivate them vis-à-vis European integration and how they keep the high levels of support for the EU, right? Given that the EU's agenda focuses a lot on the youth and on identity issues. And this came out of the civic discussions, like as a suggestion for further research. And we have been also discussing these among our team as an interesting line. And finally, maybe the question that stayed widely open was whether the consensus, right, regarding this importance of the European integration will be sustained, or whether instead it is part of this general perception socially reiterated due to the lack of this in-depth debate and problematization of European issues on our media. Or if I put it in more simple terms, will this consensus resist the politicization of this issue? And of course, this is to be seen, right? Was interesting. We really got nice takeaways from our civic discussions.
Absolutely. I'm always surprised also to hear like exactly, differences in opinion, how the youth is extremely important and matters. Also how the more kind of what one sometimes categorizes as classically Eurosceptic or far-right parties in each different country in the EU is not actually the same. So in some places they're Eurosceptic, in some places they're actually pro-EU, and there are facets in there. And I think you also, from our study, we've also seen in other countries that the same applies on the left. Some left-wing parties are more Eurosceptic, some left-wing parties are more pro-EU. So what we're seeing with our study, and we also see it here with Portugal, is that the stratification, voters are more complex. They're not so simple. They're not just left-wing, right-wing, center, pro-EU, anti-EU. They're complex. Okay, so let me move on to maybe the third question, which is kind of like looking back at what you just explained, the survey findings as well as the civic discussions. Can you point out like kind of a few standout insights that EU policymakers, or any policymakers for that sake, should particularly focus on and maybe take away from these discussions?
Yes, sure. Maybe three main lines of recommendations that we arrived after this exercise. So a first point I'd like to make is this idea that further knowledge and literacy on political and EU-related issues is needed. So this also comes out from what I was just saying, right? And our results are very much correlated. I think this is the case in other countries too, to the level of education and income, meaning that those that are better educated and earning more usually demonstrate a better knowledge, right, on EU issues. And this indicates also, to some extent, a lack of access to quality information that promotes interest in political and EU-related matters, right, enabling civic engagement through more informed participation. So in this sense, the recommendation would be to promote initiatives that bring civil society organizations, and here we talk about local associations, unions, and even the ordinary citizen, right? Bring them closer to EU affairs in their capacity of agents, and not just as general public, right? Such as through civic training, also raising awareness in educational curricula on political issues, representativity, the direct democratic participation. Institutions functioning both at the national and EU levels could contribute to this, and definitely ensure enlarged reach and scope of EU knowledge, as EU issues are about economics and politics, but also about social aspects, the environment, other topics of relevance, right, with impacting the population daily lives. And so this would be a first recommendation. A second recommendation would be to strengthening journalism and media literacy, not only in Portugal, let's say, but also at the EU level. This is resulting from the fact that overall media trust is high in Portugal, but as we mentioned, quality and independent reporting and journalism require material conditions that have been lacking. This was very much underlined by journalists in our civic discussions. And also the media should ensure greater depth and diversity of perspective on the news, right? Produce more in-depth analyses, investigative reports, somehow expand the space for larger political and ideological representation. There is clearly in Portuguese media space for all voices, but still providing more space and time would be welcomed. So for these, our recommendation would be implementing an EU-wide policy that supports fair labor agreements for journalists, invest in specialized education for journalists on EU and foreign affairs, funds independent and alternative media outlets, and of course continues to promote media literacy projects that can enhance diverse and informed public discourse on EU issues, right, which seems to us a good way forward. And finally, another recommendation would be to enhance civic engagement and strengthen EU identity through inclusive participation and transparent dialogue. And we suggest this because trust in European institutions, such as the European Commission and the Parliament, is notably higher among the Portuguese than their national institutions. And there is clearly also support for European integration among the Portuguese. So this means that developing policies tailored to spread EU identity by strengthening the citizens' connections with the Union, particularly promoting, for example, gender equality, political engagement across all demographics, is a way to consider. And this should go hand in hand with an assertive strategy also to counter disinformation. This is, of course, key, right? The use of disinformation in political and ideological disputes affecting political, societal polarization and mistrust, of course, in public institutions has been disseminated widely. We are all aware of these and should become clearly center stage. So despite the several mechanisms and institutional framework in place in Portugal, which is quite institutionalized and in line with European initiatives, we should go for a more assertive strategy to counter disinformation, particularly in articulation with the media themselves, to assure a more comprehensive outreach and responsibility ownership from both the political sector and these key actors, right, in the information sphere. And so I think this would be the main recommendations our team would put forward in this regard.
Again, the focus on disinformation, foreign interference, all these issues that we face is so important, and it can't be repeated enough. What's also I find very, very insightful is, this also the fact that, well, I mean, the media is at risk everywhere, not only in Portugal, but all across the European Union face similar problems. So there has to be more attention paid towards that. And then finally, I find it so interesting, this fact that nearly every single country in our project shows that there's more trust towards the EU than there is towards national authorities. So, I mean, this is really like, what an important way to provide a recommendation to the EU that now is the time to really invest and support identity building at a European level, show the importance of the EU and its institutions, because the polls and the data shows that it's in their advantage. So yeah, thanks so much for raising these points. Okay, so at this point, our discussion has essentially come to an end. And so I would just like to really take the opportunity to thank you, Maria Raquel, for taking the time for joining me.
Thank you so much, Samuel. It was my pleasure.
And so if you're interested as a listener in finding out more about the project and the people behind it, accessing some of the summaries of our key results that we've been discussing, as well as the findings of our research publications, all you have to do is visit our website, which is www.mediatized.eu. You can subscribe to our newsletter, and you can also follow us on Twitter or X at mediatized_EU. Thank you so much.